think it's going. Yes, action.
Okay. So my first question is, tell me about your experiences or background, like working with the EL students.
So I've been a teacher now I've been an educator for 10 years. My first 5 years of teaching was with 8th graders at a large comprehensive charter school. It was a one-off independent charter school, and I taught primarily ELL students. So in about my second year, I started to develop a specialty in working with ELL students, and I partnered with we had an ELD coordinator at the time.
What's ELD?
English Language Development for ELL, English Language Learners. So she and I worked on presentations to the staff, and we also worked on programs targeted specifically for our English language learners. We also wrote a grant and piloted a boot camp just for ELL students over the summer. Mm-hmm. And we won an award for it.
Oh, cool.
Yeah, so it was really effective in helping them prepare for their school year.
Cool. Okay, so what do you think makes a good teacher, like in general, not necessarily ELL specific, but like in general?
I think the best teachers are workers, worker bees. I also think the best teachers are creative, extremely creative, and they're by nature problem solvers.
And off of that, do you think that there's a difference then between a good teacher and a good ELL teacher? Are there like specific qualities that you think make a better ELL teacher?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think that first of all, just having the mindset of shifting your focus from what's good for the whole class, and especially even what's good for classroom management, to what it feels like to be an ELL student is really important. So I think that a successful teacher of English language learners is someone who's been in a situation like the students
Mm-hmm.
have. So someone who's traveled into a country where they don't speak the language, or someone who really took language classes seriously with a desire to master the language, not just kind of get through their A through G. And then also, again, kind of going back to that idea of being in that experience, being in a place where you're really struggling to be understood day in and day out, from the moment you wake up to the moment you fall asleep. So that's a whole different type of struggle than what some people experience when they're always in their primary language.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Definitely. So then on that, do you feel like there's special precautions or things that we should take for ELL students regarding state standards, specifically like language standards, like English standards or anything like that?
I think well, I'm going to answer this in two ways. I'm going to answer this generally, and I'm going to also answer it from a Cal Prep lens. Generally, I think that there are two sets of standards that you need to follow when you're teaching ELD students, and especially when you have big pockets of ELD students, or ELL students.
Yeah.
We used to call them ELD.
That's okay.
And the ELL standards are really intuitive when you look at them. They make so much sense, and yet most people who teach secondary, they only use their standards, their content standards. They don't really look at the ELD standards at all.
So there do exist two sets?
Oh yeah. There's a whole set of English language learner standards. And elementary school teachers tend to use them in their lesson planning a lot more than secondary teachers do. And then also teachers who are in some large comprehensive schools, there are specific classes that serve that population. So they're not fully integrated classrooms. They're classrooms that say, I'm working specifically with students who are at the English language development of intermediate.
Oh,
and so the strategies are quite different than they would be if you were teaching that same content area with a very mixed classroom. Mm-hmm. So that's huge.
Yeah.
But the thing is if we had the time and the motivation and just we're really problem solving for meeting the needs of English language learners in the classroom, you'll notice that the very best teaching that you would do for gifted and talented students is very much alike what you should do for English language learners. So it's constructivist type of planning.
Cool.
and it's project-based learning. It's just that there would be more activities that are really language-based, and I'm doing this with my hands touchy-feely because you need a lot of manipulatives when you're working with English language learners, and you need some scaffolds that the GATE students or the traditional GATE students wouldn't necessarily need.
And so then since there are two, but do you still think that we should hold ELL students to the same state standards, especially at the secondary level, or even at primary, as we do kids who already speak English?
So,
or should there be provisions?
Well, I think the differentiation is gigantic and huge and really important. And the content standards that we ask for, there's a deep level of rigor in secondary. But when folks are still working with developing language skills and the ability to communicate, you do need to keep the two in mind always.
Yeah.
So that a paper that a student at the intermediate level scoring on the CELT, a paper that they write should have different, at least one row of that's different for the way that they communicate, or they should have different. It should have something that's different, whether it's the process where they get extra support in the language development piece, or whether it's the product itself where the communication of those standards are done in a different way, or whether during the process there's special activities for kids that develop the language piece. It's huge.
So mostly differentiation, but not necessarily you don't need to do all the standards.
Oh no, I still think that our English language learners can meet the standards, the content area standards. They just might need a different route, or they might need a different assessment.
Okay. How do you address diversity in your classroom? So it's 15 years now.
How do I
address diversity in your classroom? Whether that be so students know about it, or you dealing with it. Either of those.
Well, there's lots of ways, right?
Yeah.
So I think that they're celebrating where you're at is really important, and building in a sense of self-monitoring is really important. So kids should know what their strengths are and what their challenges are, and that shouldn't be an embarrassing thing. It shouldn't be a secret thing. It should be something that you celebrate. And so I think that one part of exploring diversity is having students kind of know who and where to turn to for certain strengths, and then also when they have their own challenges, being really aware of them and being assertive to make sure that they get the supports they deserve. So sometimes a teacher, when they're working with differentiation and they're working with diversity, it's really hard for one person to keep in mind everyone's differences. So spending time at the beginning where kids understand what their differences are and celebrate them and think that they're not that big of a deal, and just what you're working with, gives the onus on the child to advocate for themselves and to remind the teacher, hey, this is something that I'm going to need some help on. Or the reason why I'm sitting with this person is because I need some work with the language, or can we discuss this in Spanish? So those are really valid questions that we should empower students to ask, and we need to front load that at the beginning to say this is 100% acceptable and appropriate in my classroom.
Cool. So just letting them know their own strengths and weaknesses, and then know how to activate them or find help for the weaknesses.
Well, yes, and when you introduce strategies at the beginning of the school year, and you're concentrating less on content and more on establishing routines, you give a really clear rationale for why you're doing this. We're grouped in this way because some people have challenges with, just the English language and learning how to communicate this, and this is a time to practice. So when you put that rationale on the reason why you're grouping people, then kids can later on say, can we group like this? Because right now I'm struggling with language.
Cool. So being really transparent.
Being very transparent.
Good stuff. And what is your own teaching philosophy that can be apart from ELL or with ELL included?
That changes sometimes.
Right.
In general, my teaching philosophy is that all students can learn, and not just all students can learn, but all students can fly, they can excel. There are different rates of learning, and there are different strategies that unlock that learning. And I think that having kids find that pathway to what works for them is the best thing that we can do as educators, because the content will always change. It's every child and every person's mission to kind of find what their own path is, but we need to make sure that we're unlocking as many doors as possible. So, and failure, yay. Celebrating failure and celebrating challenges because they make us stronger is something that, I always kind of want to push for myself and for the students that I work with, because there is a path to
Yeah,
for everyone.
And final question, what advice do you have for, especially since you've taught so much ELL, what advice do you have for teaching ELL students, whether that be in secondary or primary or both in general?
Sometimes we talk about this whole idea of will versus skill, and I tend to find ELL students as sometimes, not always, but being maybe low skilled in some areas, but very high will. And for them, there's such an imperative with learning and such a joy to teach students with that ability. So with that mindset, is that, I don't think that there's a single child in general who doesn't want to learn, but for an ELL student in particular, there's every single day, it's like, give me what I need. And that's so exciting. And really making sure that you work with families and make them a part of the process, and reminding them that even if it's really challenging because of language, there's amazing skill sets that child has and that family has that will accelerate learning in the future, even if it's slowing them down right now. So having a little bit of zest and having a little bit of, what was that other word? Grit. Zest and grit. I think that makes up an ELL student pretty well.
Cool. And those are all the questions I have, so I'm going to turn off the thing for it.